Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Amashinda. I am your host, Stanley Savande, and I appreciate you taking the time to join me on this little journey that we are taking to explore various topics and various aspects of African history, economically, politically, spiritually, and in many, many different ways to get a better understanding of this continent and where we come from as a people, and to have the story of Africans be told from the perspective of Africans in a way that isn't influenced, bastardized, and warped by the various different influences that exist around the world today. So sit back, relax, and let's jump into it. So when it comes to the conversation around the liberation struggles of various Southern African countries and the achievement of the peace and stability that some of them have come to be known for, I don't think the central importance of Lusaka and the diplomatic work of the Kaunda administration is given the attention and credit it duly deserves. In this episode, I'll be highlighting various bits of history regarding Lusaka, Zambia more broadly, and how this city and country are the most politically significant region in Southern Africa for the achievement of independence and liberation and stability. In this video, I'll be highlighting policies, agreements, and key freedom fighters who were instrumental to various liberation movements and the impactful relations they had to Zambia and Lusaka at various points of their development. So with all that out of the way, I think we should get into it. And I think it's fitting that we start off with the Lusaka Manifesto on Southern Africa, which was signed by 13 East and Central African nations at its creation between the 14th and 16th of April, 1969. It was a document created to oppose minority colonial rule across the African countries and by extension to endorse and support the liberation struggles many Southern African countries were going through in any way that they could. Kaunda played a very pivotal role as one of the key advocates of the manifesto and host of the convention that took place in Lusaka that led to the creation of the document. So I'm going to read a small excerpt from the document to give you a rough idea of the sentiment that was held by the signatory governments that initially backed the document. This is paragraph 2 of the final document that was published by the government of Tanzania. By this manifesto, we wish to make clear beyond all shadow of doubt our acceptance of the belief that all men are equal and have equal rights to human dignity and respect, regardless of color, race, religion, or sex. We believe that all men have the right and the duty to participate as equal members of society in their own government. We do not accept that any individual or group has any right to govern any other group of sane adults without their consent, and we affirm that only the people of a society acting together as equals can determine what is for them a good society and a good social, economic, or political organization. End quote. So the Lusaka Manifesto, after its publishing and after its creation in 1969, would later, in the same year of 1969, on September 9th of that year, actually be adopted by the Organization of African Unity, and it would subsequently be endorsed to the UN General Assembly. And the UN would later also adopt and endorse the Lusaka Manifesto on the 20th of September that same year at the 24th General Assembly. There was a roll call vote that resulted in 113 states being in favor of the Lusaka Manifesto on Southern Africa and 2 states being against it. And then 2 states absented voting on the resolution. So the 2 states that were against it were Portugal and South Africa, obviously. And the 2 states that absented were Cuba and Malawi. I believe that the reason Cuba absented in voting on this resolution was because Cuba held the very true opinion that when it came to the liberation of the African people, it would only be truly achieved through armed struggle. And the adoption and the endorsement of the Lusaka Manifesto would hinder and would jeopardize the armed struggles that various Southern African and just generally African countries were engaging in. I don't think I need to explain to you guys why South Africa and Portugal opposed the resolution to adopt the Lusaka Manifesto. But for those of you who may not know, South Africa at the time was going through apartheid, and Portugal had 2 colonies in Southern Africa that they were trying very, very hard to hold on to, and this would obviously throw a spanner in the works for them. They were also going through an armed struggle with the Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, Frelimo, in Mozambique, and I believe they were also going through an armed struggle with the MPLA and UNITA in Angola. So Kaunda's position as key negotiator was so significant that when U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger visited South Africa on behalf of the U.S. to extend efforts in trying to reach some sort of an amicable resolution on the Southern African security situation, he went to Kaunda with his report from the meeting he had with B.J. Vorster and Ian Smith in Pretoria. In the conversation that was happening between the apartheid government and also the Rhodesian government and the armed groups that were essentially fighting for their liberation in apartheid South Africa and in Rhodesia, the conversation would mostly happen and be mediated by Kaunda, because all of these movements, like I mentioned before at the beginning of this episode, were in some way, shape, or form associated to Zambia. A lot of them had presence in Zambia. A lot of them had their headquarters in Zambia. And so whenever any sort of diplomatic conversation would need to happen between one colonial government and the armed groups that were engaged in a liberation struggle against these governments, it would in some way, shape, or form typically involve Kenneth Kaunda. And that's why when Henry Kissinger came down to Southern Africa, he had to go and report to Kaunda about what was discussed, because there was nobody else to report to. If you wanted to have access to all of these armed groups in pretty much any country that was going through an armed struggle in Southern Africa, the point of contact was Kenneth Kaunda. So yes, the following is, I'm going to read an excerpt from a telegram that Henry Kissinger sent to the United States, to the U.S. President's Assistant for National Security Affairs. He sent this telegram on September 21st, 1976, after having a meeting with Kaunda. From Pretoria, I flew to Lusaka, Zambia on Monday to report to President Kaunda what I had obtained from Vorster and Smith. I went over with Kaunda in a 3-hour private meeting the Rhodesia program that Smith had accepted. The 5 points I reported to you yesterday for majority rule in 2 years and an immediate provisional government. I told him this is what they had been seeking for 11 years, and now was the time to move. So at this point, when Kissinger was getting involved in this conversation, the Second Chimurenga, which was the war that led to the liberation of Zimbabwe, had been raging on since around 1964. And it was getting to a point where something desperately needed to be done about it. And that's where you see Henry Kissinger jumping in and getting involved in this conversation. So the Lusaka Manifesto would go on to aid the independence of many of the countries that made up the frontline states. The frontline states was a multilateral coalition of mostly Southern African states that did a lot to isolate apartheid South Africa through many efforts, through economic activity, through provision of military aid and refuge, predominantly for the ANC and the Southwest African People's Organization, which was the liberation movement that was engaging in the fight for liberation in Namibia. And they also isolated South Africa through a lot of, on the diplomatic front, through a lot of diplomatic pressure at the level of the UN. A lot of these states were members of the OAU, so they could sort of band together and isolate South Africa on the diplomatic front by constantly lobbying the UN to accept resolutions like the Lusaka Manifesto and many other declarations that were made by the UN. And a lot of these efforts would be spearheaded by Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia and Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, who was the prime minister, or I believe president of Tanzania. Yeah, so that was the Lusaka Manifesto in Southern Africa. And if you'd like to check it out, there's going to be a link in the description where you can check out all of the resources that I used to bring all of this information to you guys. So when we talk about the Lusaka Manifesto, I feel like it ties in very nicely to the next point that I would like to highlight, which is the Lusaka Accord. And the Lusaka Accord, or the Lusaka Agreement, as some people refer to it as, was signed on the 7th of September 1974 between the Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, Frelimo, and the Portuguese government. This agreement declared the independence of Mozambique and the end of a 400-year occupation and colonial rule. It also declared the end of a guerrilla war that had been raging on for about 10 years up until that point. So this agreement set up a provisional government headed by Frelimo that presided over the gradual transition of power from the Portuguese colonial administration to Frelimo, and full independence would be achieved by June 25th, 1975. This was a landmark victory for the two states of Tanzania and Zambia that were actively spearheading the push for liberation of Southern African states from colonial rule. It was even more of a victory because both Tanzania and Zambia had offered refuge and support to Frelimo from its founding all throughout its liberation struggle. I believe Frelimo was founded in Tanzania, or when it was founded, it opened up one of its first headquarters in Tanzania, which would move to Zambia for a couple of years around the mid-60s. But the first headquarters that Frelimo had would have been in Tanzania. So the defeat of Portugal and the liberation of Mozambique was one that was received with much ire by the minority Portuguese population that dwelled within Mozambique, as is typically the case with independence that is achieved in Africa. And there were quite a few reported outbreaks of violence by the Portuguese. The New York Times reported on this on September 7th, 1974. And I'm going to read a small excerpt from that article. And you can also check it out online because all of this stuff is available online for free. But yeah, this is an excerpt from that report. Several hand grenades exploded here early today following violent demonstrations by groups of whites protesting against talks between Portugal and the Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, which have led to the announcement of Mozambique's independence. The grenade explosions, one at the university and several others near an African suburb on the outskirts of the capital, followed a rampage by hundreds of young whites who broke windows and tried to set fire to a political group's offices, end quote. So this, of course, is on the back of Portugal having been one of the only two countries that voted against a motion at the UN to adopt the Lusaka Manifesto in 1969, along with South Africa. The Lusaka Manifesto being a very crucial document and doctrine that played a significant role in helping achieve the independence of Mozambique. So through the Lisbon-Salisbury-Pretoria axis, which was a multilateral sort of coalition that was created by the colonial administrations in Southern Africa, along with pretty much every European country, including Britain, Portugal also played a major role in illegally supplying Rhodesia with military and economic support by smuggling weapons from European manufacturers into Rhodesia and by funneling Rhodesian trade through Portuguese companies and masking that there was business that was being funneled to Rhodesia through various shell companies that were opened in Portugal and were also opened in many, many other European countries. I'm sure those of you who are aware or know something about the Second Chimurenga will know that the Rhodesian fowl is often referred to as the right arm of the West. I believe that is the term that is used. But for anybody who knows anything about guns, the fowl is a firearm that was developed and created by FN Herstal, which is a company from Belgium. And the only way that Rhodesia was able to get access and import so many fowls into Rhodesia to field the Rhodesian army in this armed struggle was because of Portugal, because there were front-facing sanctions that were issued against Rhodesia, and those sanctions had to be followed. or countries had to pretend as if they were following those sanctions, which is exactly what they did. So the following is an excerpt I'm going to read from a book where Ken Flower, who was a police officer and intelligence operative in Rhodesia, actually an intelligence chief in the Central Intelligence Organization of Rhodesia, speaks about all of this activity that was going on between various European states and the country of Rhodesia itself. Those who worked behind the scenes in the evasion of sanctions were legion. Senators and congressmen from the United States of America, representatives of British and French companies who concealed their origins by dealing through South Africa or elsewhere, Swiss, Italian, and Japanese businessmen who came and went without any qualms, West Germans who, amongst other things, arranged to send an expensive printing press in a disguised Rhodesian Air Force plane so that Rhodesian banknotes could be printed locally, not in Britain. Greeks and Jews who were more than ready to set up dummy companies and disguise the Rhodesian origins or destination of certain goods, and Russians who plied their ships in and out of Mozambican ports to load Rhodesian chromite. So yes, for all those of you who I will refer to as simps for the Soviet Union and for socialist Russia, it turns out that socialist Russia also got its hands quite dirty when it came to supporting the Rhodesians. Everybody was involved in this, and it also creates a more interesting conversation, because when you look at people and the conversation or the dialogue that happens online about why Rhodesia fell and why it didn't survive, you will have a lot of these nostalgic cave-dwelling troglodytes who are constantly talking about, oh, Rhodesia fell because it was abandoned by the West. And the reality, at least the reality according to Ken Flower, who was an intelligence chief and somebody who was very, very aware of the inner workings of the Rhodesian government, the reality is that the West didn't actually abandon Rhodesia. They were very much in bed with them. And at every single step that the Rhodesians were trying to quell the rebellion that was happening against them, they had the full support of Europe and the United States. They had the full support of the West. And even with all of that support that the Rhodesians had from all of these countries that they were very clearly involved with in engaging with economic activity, in engaging with arms smuggling, in engaging with various forms of help and aid that was being rendered to the Rhodesians secretly, they still fell. Rhodesia didn't fall because it was abandoned by the West. Rhodesia failed because it was not a feasible project that could happen without the mass extinction and ethnic cleansing that they actually tried to engage in and failed at miserably. That's why Rhodesia fell, and for no other reason. So for anybody who tells you about Rhodesia being abandoned by the West and Rhodesia falling because the West got cold feet and couldn't stand by their brothers, it's complete bullshit. Tell them to go read a fucking book. So Tinashe Nyamunda, who wrote a very, very interesting paper about this whole situation and gives some very, very useful insights on the Salisbury-Pretoria Lisbon axis, goes on to say this in that particular paper. As a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, Portugal's relationship with Rhodesia facilitated some of these secret dealings. The use of Mozambique was just as beneficial to Rhodesia and Portugal as it was to the Russians, who flouted sanctions and bought Rhodesian chrome for the bigger cause of their Cold War effort. The same can be said for American and other foreign businessmen who gained access to Rhodesian business through trilateral relations established with Rhodesia through the Axis. If anything, successive U.S. administrations practiced a policy of cautious, measured hostility against Rhodesia, whom they never wanted to absolutely alienate. In the case of Britain, economic sanctions were initially inadequate because of its kith and kin considerations, which resulted in an error of judgment that contributed to the many uncomfortable moments with which successive British governments were burdened for the 15 years before majority rule. The vacuum left by Britain in southern Rhodesia was filled by Portugal as its main European ally, and London could not apply pressure beyond the diplomatic appeals to Pretoria to stop supporting Rhodesia. Against this backdrop, even British companies that could not officially do business in Rhodesia utilized the back door provided by the Axis. End quote. So there you have it. I know we started this talking about the independence of Mozambique, but we went on a bit of a tangent and ended up getting involved in Rhodesia, which we will touch on a bit more as the podcast goes. But yeah, the relation, obviously, like from the standpoint of liberation, the relation between Zimbabwe, Zambia, South Africa is inseparable. Just as it is inseparable when it comes to the fight against the liberation of, South Africa, the fight against the liberation of Mozambique, the fight against the liberation of Zimbabwe. Those three things are inseparable, which is something that I only ended up finding out when I was doing research for this particular episode that we are on right now. So seeing as we're already talking about Rhodesia, I think it is fitting to continue in this lane that we found ourselves in and talk a bit about the crucial role that Zambia played during the Second Chimurenga, with the support that they rendered to the Zimbabwe African People's Union, Zapu, and its military wing, the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, ZIPRA. Now, Zambia did host both the Zimbabwe African People's Union and the Zimbabwe African National Union, which was the other political party that was engaged in an armed struggle through the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, ZANLA. But this little section here mostly deals with the relations between Zapu and the Kaunda administration and Lusaka. So Zapu was a successor to the National Democratic Party, which was banned by the Rhodesian government under Edgar Whitehead in December of 1961. The NDP was a successor to the Southern Rhodesia African National Congress, which was banned in February of 1959 under Whitehead's government as well. Edgar Whitehead passed security laws that were meant, in his words, to deprive the African leaders of their civil and political rights. Examples of those laws that he passed being the Preventive Detention Act, which enabled the government to lock up anyone for 5 years without trial, the Unlawful Organization Act, which banned almost all the African political organizations which existed in Southern Rhodesia, and also the organizations of Africans in Nyasaland and in Northern Rhodesia. The following excerpt that I'm going to read is from a paper that was written by Joshua Nkomo, who was the founder and leader of all the nationalist African parties that I just mentioned. The paper is called Crucible of Privilege, Southern Rhodesia. And he wrote this in 1959, just a few months before the banning of the Southern Rhodesian African National Congress. And yeah, here it is. There is still time for Southern Rhodesia to retreat from disaster, and with dignity. We of the Congress, by the very nature of our policy, offer the settlers the opportunity of beating a retreat in time. We ask the reconsideration of discriminatory laws, the Native Affairs Act, the Urban Areas and Accommodation Act, the Pass Laws, the Electoral Act, the Unlawful Organization Act, and the Preventive Detention Act, end quote. So following all attempts at the pursuit of a diplomatic solution being blocked and stonewalled by the ever right-wing leaning Rhodesian government, the Zimbabwe African People's Union was formed, and that also got subsequently banned in September of 1962. And the following is a quote from Abraham Nkiwane, who was recruited by Joshua Nkomo to bring weapons into Zimbabwe from Tanzania through Zambia. In 1962, when Zapu was banned, we were summoned to UNIP headquarters by President Kaunda. At the end of the meeting, I was summoned to Mr. Kapwepe's home, where I met with Joshua Nkomo, Kenneth Kaunda, and Simon Mwansa Kapwepe. So Simon Mwansa Kapwepe, for those of you who don't know, was a very crucial element of achieving Zambian independence, and was a very key ally for Kaunda in the first 8 years of the governing of Zambia after it achieved independence. And just also a random factoid for you, Zambia has the name that it has right now because it was given by Simon Mwanza-Kipwepwe. In my opinion, he's one of the most brilliant minds, politically, culturally, that ever existed in Zambia. And anybody who's able to get their hands on his works, the ones in English and the ones in Bemba, if you can read Bemba, please do, and read up on the incredible mind that Simon Mwanza-Kipwepwe had. Okay, back to the quote. At the meeting, they asked me if I could spare some time in the following weeks and months in assisting Zapu cadres who were to do some missions between Mbeya in Tanzania and Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe, end quote. The weapons would be smuggled from Egypt through Tanzania and Zambia, according to the South African History Archives. So Richard Dube, who was a commander of Zipra operations and spent quite a lot of time in their Zambian bases and camps, describes the approach they had to deal with air bombardment from the Rhodesians, because there was quite a lot of air bombardment coming from the Rhodesians with the help of the South Africans through various ways. Because when the armed struggle was happening, operations were being launched from Zambia. There would be small sort of encampments of freedom fighters that would be formed somewhere and would be dotted across the Zimbabwean bush at any given time, pretty close to the Zambian border. But the bases where planning would happen, the bases where weapons would be stored, the bases where supplies would be replenished were mostly in Zambia. So the Rhodesians, realizing that, would engage in bombing campaigns against those bases in Zambia. And they would also engage in bombing campaigns against refugee encampments, because the War of Liberation in Zimbabwe for the Rhodesians was not just a war to quell the rebellion and stop the terrorists. It was a war of extermination. What they wanted to do, and what they had initially planned out to do from the time that the project of Rhodesia started, from the unilateral declaration of independence, was to get rid of the native population that existed, to squeeze them into small areas of land that was not viable and that could not provide any sort of economic gain, and to populate the land that people were ethnically cleansed from through mass immigration of Europeans into Rhodesia. So the quote goes as so. What used to happen in the camps in Zambia during those days when the Smith regime was bombing, each morning the commander would evacuate the base or the camp, move the people maybe some 10 kilometers north, others south, others east, so that the camp would remain empty space and vacant. When the camp was empty, even if the enemy came, it would just bomb the camp and the people would be safe, far away from the center of the camp, end quote. In 1977, Kenneth Kaunda announced that Zambia was in a state of war with Rhodesia. At this point, the war had been raging on between liberation forces and the settler occupation forces for about 13 years. And the Washington Post actually reported on this in an article that was released on May 16th of 1977. And you can read up on that in your own time. But yeah, during these years, Joshua Nkomo, who was the founder and the leader of Zapu and one of the key negotiators of achieving Zimbabwe's independence, was based in Lusaka and had assumed the role of supreme military commander. By 1978 to 79, the Rhodesians were trying to contain Zipper forces in Zambia and were failing horribly. Richard Dube actually describes how the Rhodesian forces had to retreat when they faced off against one of the 3 Zipper battalions that had received training in Zambia at Mulungushi. Mulungushi, for those of you who don't know, is in central Zambia. So the quote goes as so. They had already tested that when they attacked the battalion at Kariba. It was one of the battalions that had been trained at Mulungushi. The battle at Feira took almost 2 weeks. Then they were unable to defeat that battalion and they lost quite a good number of planes and men. They realized if they could be resisted by a single battalion using all the equipment and special forces they had, what more with 3 battalions? End quote. I could keep on going on this topic and adding in more quotes and so on and so forth, but this would end up being a much longer video than it's already going to be. And I think we've given quite a bit of time to speaking about Rhodesia. Maybe that's something I should dedicate a singular episode to doing, because there is quite a lot of information, most of which is not available online, because the only perspective or the majority of the perspective that tells the story of the Second Chimurenga is told from the perspective of people who are fawning over and sucking the dick of the Rhodesians online. Excuse my language. So I'm sort of going to end it here and move on to the next thing. But the last thing that I will mention about Lusaka and Kaunda's importance in the liberation of Zimbabwe is this one thing. When Robert Mugabe was released from an 11-year prison sentence in Rhodesia, he went into exile. And he spent a good bit of that time in Zambia, along with spending some time in Mozambique, where most of the Zimbabwe African National Union's military operations were being launched from. Mugabe, on top of him having spent quite a bit of time in Zambia during his exile after his release from prison, much earlier in the mid-1950s, Mugabe also spent some time in Zambia as a lecturer at Chalimbana Teacher Training College, which is in Lusaka. And he spent the years of 1955 to 1959 in Zambia as a lecturer at this teacher training college. And while he was there, he was also studying for his Bachelor of Education. He was also studying for his Bachelor of Education degree from the University of London through correspondence. Yeah, that's just a nice little random factoid I thought I should throw in there for you guys to chew on a bit. Okay, so moving on to the next thing. So the first meeting that ever openly happened between South African big business and the ANC happened on September 13th, 1985 in Zambia at Kenneth Kaunda's private game ranch in Mfuwe, Zambia. It was attended by Oliver Tambo, who was the ANC president, Thabo Mbeki, Chris Hani, Mark Maharaj, and Palone Jordan, who were part of the ANC contingent. And then the representatives of South African big business who attended this meeting were Tony Bloom, who was the CEO of Premier Milling or Premier Group, depending on which era of Premier you are referring to. Gavin Relly, the CEO of Anglo American. Everybody on the planet knows who Anglo American is. I don't think I need to explain who those people are. Zach De Beer, who was a director at Anglo American. Tertius Mayberg, who was the Sunday Times editor, and Harold Backendorf, who was the editor of Die Vaderland. I hope I'm saying that correctly. So along with that, on October 11th, 1985, Frederick Van Zyl led a Progressive Federal Party delegation to Zambia. The Progressive Federal Party had always maintained a pretty critical stance in relation to the ANC's economic policies, and they had also recognized that the ANC was likely to become the key to achieving a new political dispensation in South Africa, which I guess they were right about that. The meeting took place between Alfred Nzo, Thabo Mbeki, Mark Maharaj, Thomas Nkobi, and Gertrude Shope on the ANC contingent. And then the Progressive Federal Party contingent was Frederick Van Zyl, Colin Eglin, Alex Boraine, and Peter Gastro. A total of more than 40 meetings happened between some form of religious, media, political, or business representative of the minority white ruling class in South Africa and the ANC between 1984 and 1990 in Zambia only. There's many meetings that happened between representatives of the minority white ruling class in South Africa and the ANC. Many happened in the United States, some happened in other places in Europe and so on and so forth. But there was also quite a lot of them that happened in Zambia. And I would also go even further to argue that the most significant meetings that led to the biggest development and the most amount of progress within the conversation that was happening between minority white ruling class in South Africa and the ANC, most of those meetings happened in Zambia. That is a stance that I stand by very, very firmly. And for those of you who want to sort of see a pretty detailed chronology of all of the meetings that happened between the minority white ruling class representatives and the ANC, those that happened in Zambia, those that happened in different places of the world, you can actually find a pretty conclusive, detailed list of all of these meetings that happened on the SA History website online. And I'll also link to it in the description below for those of you who'd like to check it out. And I suggest you do. It's very fascinating stuff. So during his 30-year exile from South Africa, Oliver Tambo spent about 22 years of that time in many safe houses sort of dotted across Zambia. His favorite safe house being the one that is located in Chelston, Zambia, where a large majority of ANC operations ran from. Actually, it was the ANC headquarters for quite a while. This house is now known as the Oliver Tambo Heritage House and has been open to the public for visits and tours since October 2017, I believe. The event that opened this house to the public for visiting and for education was actually attended and commemorated by then President Jacob Zuma, who himself actually spent quite a bit of time in Zambia as well between 1987 and 1990, and along with fellow former President Thabo Mbeki, who also spent many stretches of time in Zambia during his 18-year exile from 1971 to 1990. And just a little side note for you guys, another little random factoid, because I found quite a few of these as I was looking into this. When Mandela was released from prison, 16 days after his official release from Robben Island, because there are quite a few people who say that Mandela was actually released from Robben Island quite a few years before all of us have been led to believe. But I'm not going to get into that. But anyway, when Mandela was officially released from prison in 1990, 16 days after his release from prison, he embarked on a 17-day sort of victory lap, visiting various different places. And the first place that he visited after he was released from prison was Zambia. When he reached Zambia, one of the people who was there to receive him was Yasser Arafat. The first time that Nelson Mandela and Yasser Arafat, who was the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, met in person was on Zambian soil. That fills me with a great deal of pride. It's also created quite a bit of sadness in me, looking at some of the decisions and some of the diplomatic relations that Zambia has been courting and revitalizing in the last few weeks, considering the history that exists when it comes to our dispossession towards the liberation movements of people all over the planet, and what our firm stance has been, looking at the decisions that Zambia has been making in the last couple of weeks. As of recording this in December of 2025, I'm very, very saddened to see the direction in which my country is going, because there was a very clear doctrine, there was a very clear direction that was set by our founding fathers, a direction that was so clear and so firm that when the University of Zambia was being built, which was the first university that was built, and it was built by the Kaunda administration, one of the companies that they got, that they commissioned to plan a certain section of the university and build that section, was an Israeli contractor company. And at some point during the construction of that particular section, works were abandoned and they were never completed. And it's because of the fact that there was a clear stance that was had by Kenneth Kaunda when it came to the relations between the state of Israel and the people of Palestine. And that position that Kenneth Kaunda had, which set the standard and set the direction that we went in as Zambia for a very long time, led to the abandonment of the works that were being done by the Israelis in Zambia. And it seems there are a lot of people who are in power right now who've forgotten where we come from, who've forgotten the directives that were left to us by our founding fathers, and who are taking Zambia in a very different and dangerous direction. But yes, I thought I should just add that in there, and I'm going to move on to the next thing. So at this point, I would like to throw out a few honorable mentions of things that I found that I think needs to be highlighted when it comes to this idea and this argument that I am making about Zambia being the most politically significant place in Southern Africa when it comes to the achievement of liberation for Southern African countries. The first honorable mention I'm going to throw out there is the founding meeting of the Southern African Development Coordination Conference, the SADCC, which is the predecessor to SADC today, which is the Southern African Development Committee, happened in Lusaka on April 1st, 1980. So the meeting happened as a follow-up to a meeting between foreign ministries of the frontline states in May of 1979 in Gaborone, Botswana. And the conclusion of the Gaborone meeting was that ministers responsible for economic development of each respective state needed to meet next, and that meeting would happen in July of the same year. And that rolled into the meeting that officially established the SADCC in the following year in Lusaka in April. The initial goal of the formation of the Southern African Development Coordination Conference between the frontline states was to form a bloc that would collaborate economically and politically to reduce dependence on apartheid South Africa and to also isolate it within the region. For those of you that may not be aware, the frontline states were all the states, mostly in Southern Africa, that were under majority black rule at the time, which was every Southern African country with the exception of Namibia and South Africa. The SADC and the existence of the SADC today in some way is thanks to the efforts of Kaunda and many, many other people, but Lusaka, again, played a very crucial and central role in ensuring that the SADC was created. So the second honorable mention is, while Zambia only got its independence in 1964, Kenneth Kaunda was still in attendance and made many contributions to the drafting of the Charter of the Organization of African Unity in May 1963. The OAU, for those of you who don't know, would later become the African Union, the AU today, which is supposed to be the organization that brings together all African states and encourages many things that have to do with economic integration and the stamping out of colonialism and neocolonialism and so on and so forth. So he also served as president of the OAU from 1970 to 1971 and from 1987 to 1988. In fact, at his death in 2021, Kenneth Kaunda was the last living founding father of the Organization of African Unity, and he was also the last living founding father of SADC. So there's your nice little tidbit of information there. The third one is between August 1st and 9th of 1979, Kenneth Kaunda in Lusaka hosted the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, or Commonwealth Conference, which was the first time that the meeting of Commonwealth heads had ever happened on African soil. And the first place that they came to do that was Zambia, which is, pretty cool. I don't like the existence of a Commonwealth, because it's really just all of the people that were brutally subjugated by Britain, but it is what it is. And then the fourth little honorable mention that I'm gonna give to you guys is Zambia was also a consistent presence in assisting in some way, shape, or form almost every liberation movement that went on to achieve independence in Southern Africa. We've obviously mentioned this at length through talking about different liberation movements, predominantly Rhodesia, but they helped almost every single liberation movement that was engaged in armed struggle or wasn't engaged in armed struggle across Southern Africa. By the way, every single liberation movement ended up being engaged in armed struggle, because the only way to liberate yourselves from people who refuse to let go of what belongs to you is to engage in the same violence that they engaged in against you when they took what belongs to you. Don't quote me on that. But anyway, Zambia helped all of these liberation movements that went on to achieve independence in Southern Africa, with the exception of Malawi. Malawi actually got independence about 3 months before Zambia did in 1964. And yeah, so Zambia hosted the Southwest African People's Organization, SWAPO, at the African Liberation Center in Kampala. So there was an actual office that was decided on by the Zambian parliament to be given to the various different liberation struggles that were happening all across Africa. And it was located in Kampala, in Lusaka. And it was opened in 1964 after Zambia's independence. But yes, the Southwest African People's Organization had an office in this office building. and it was opened by Hifikepunye Pohamba, who was a founding member of SWAPO, working as a mobilizer for the party at the time. This, along with many other liberation movements mentioned in this next excerpt that I'm going to be reading from a SADC document that was written about Zambia's contribution to Southern African liberation. The Zambian government decided that at that stage, direct government assistance to liberation movements would be limited to the provision of office accommodation, while additional financial contributions were to be channeled through the OAU's Liberation Committee in Dar es Salaam, which had a central fund for that purpose. By 1965, foreign nationalist organizations operating in Lusaka included the Zimbabwe African People's Union, Zapu, the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, the African National Congress, the ANC, the Pan-African Congress of South Africa, PAC, the Southwest African People's Organization, SWAPO, the Caprivi African National Union, CANU, the Caprivi African People's Union, CAPU, the Mozambique Liberation Front, FRELIMO, the Mozambique National Democratic Union, UDENAMO, the Mozambique African National Congress, ANC Mozambique, the Popular Movement of the Liberation of Angola, MPLA, the Union of Populations of Angola, UPA, National Front for Liberation of Angola, FNLA, and All African Convention and Unity Movement, South Africa. The status of Zambia as the center which many liberation movements planned, launched, and sustained all types of campaigns for the purpose of achieving independence is absolutely undeniable. At the center of all this was one of the greatest diplomats and leaders that Zambia and Africa ever produced, in Kenneth Kaunda. I invite all who have had a chance to watch and listen to this to dive in and explore all the topics I've outlined here with the various sources that I've mentioned below. Thank you for watching. Thank you for wanting to learn and for joining me on this journey we're taking. And last but not least, to our forefathers who did the amazing things that fill me with the pride I have felt throughout researching and writing this episode. Mwabombeni.